It's the greatest mystery in literary history. A divisive question with highly contested answers. Who was the writer behind the pen name William Shakespeare? Welcome to Don't Quill the Messenger. Here's your host, Stephen Sable.
Welcome back, fellow Quillers, to what I think is an extremely interesting episode of exploration as we dive into the rule of law in the late 16th century as depicted in one of the Bard's so-called problem plays as a study of legal issues and the concept of justice, particularly how it pertains to the philosophical idea of mercy. Of course, it was Portia who proclaimed the quality of mercy is not strained in The Merchant of Venice, but here in a fictionalized Vienna, our author demonstrates the fickle nature of justice when she is ruled by elite powers for their own gain or motives, and the hypocritical nature of a justice that is wielded as a weapon against those who have not the power to fight back or who are not in the power to control justice at the time. It is measure for measure. During this exploration, I call upon a thesis published in 2004 by master degree candidate Virginia R. Stevens at the University of Georgia in, of course, Athens, Georgia. And I have to take a moment to note that when I was a much younger man, I once appeared as Lysander in a production of A Midsummer Night's Dream that the director set in antebellum Athens, Georgia, post-Civil War. As Lysander, I wore the Union blue uniform, and the actor portraying Demetrius wore, of course, Confederate gray. Here, Hermia's southern gentleman father, Aegeus, favored Demetrius so that Lysander and Hermia ran away into the bayou, where Oberon and Titania were depicted as a voodoo priest and priestess surrounded by their fairy folk. It was a beautiful production on a set like something out of the lagoon outside the Pirates of the Caribbean at Disneyland. We all spoke in Southern accents, which we found the text actually lent itself to quite well. The course of true love never did run smooth. And it appears that our writer also believed the course of justice never did run smooth either. And Virginia R. Stevens does a magnificent job of thoroughly analyzing measure for measure as what I believe to be the Bard's biting satirical send-up of the legal system of Elizabethan England. Nowhere that I can tell does Stevens indicate that she is a post-Stratfordian, but it is very clear that she believes the writer of the play to have had a masterful knowledge and understanding of English law and the details of the many pitfalls it contained due to its utter control by an authoritarian monarch. Stevens argues that Shakespeare's Vienna is used to depict the conflict between different modes of justice, specifically those practiced by the common law court, the ecclesiastical court, and the court of chancery. She astutely points out that the characters of Duke Vincentio, his deputy Angelo, and Aeschylus, the wise judge, all represent different means of enacting justice. And she argues that in the world of the play, just as in the Elizabethan England it represents, blind adherence to one philosophy of justice leads to the abuse of power and a failure on the part of the law to protect subjects from their rulers. Ideology is dangerous, and a strong adherence to a specific ideology more dangerous than any, especially when it controls the halls of justice. This deep meaning within the play makes the most sense if the play were written by someone who had actually fallen prey to such blind philosophies rather than blind justice. And that someone is using the play to stab at the ruler or rulers, the authoritarians in question, the deep state, as it were, of Elizabethan England. Though Isabella can be seen as modeled after several real-life characters of the Elizabethan court, and I argue there are deep shades of Anne Vavasour within that character, just as Claudio can represent the Anne and Edward de Vere illicit love affair, and Angelo can represent Queen Elizabeth herself. However, it can also be argued that Isabella represents the Queen, and we'll talk about that a little more as we move on. But Stevens cleanly points out that Isabella also represents all of us, society, community as a whole. And through Isabella's encounters with various aspects of Viennese, quote unquote, Elizabethan justice, she expresses the most important message of the play. A fully realized system of justice should embody the desires of the people that it serves. It's a rather crazy concept to push so bluntly through a play during the time of Elizabeth's reign. It's even crazier if you follow orthodoxy into belief that the play wasn't composed until or about the time King James ascended the throne. True, we do have accurate accounts of a play by this title, though we don't know the text, but by this title, and it's the only one of its kind that goes by this title. But we do have accurate accounts of such a play listed as having been written by a man named Shaxbird in the registry, spelled Shaxberd, and that play was performed for James in early 1604 as part of the holiday revels of that holiday season, 1603-1604, not long after he ascended the throne. Like so many of the Bard's plays, however, Measure for Measure is not seen in print until the first folio of 1623, nearly 20 years later. The Royal Shakespeare Company of England lists the play as having been first performed in the Elizabethan court in 1601. What an interesting play to present before an aging queen during the final years of her life. It is very possible that the play was revised and performed around that time, but there is a great deal of evidence that suggests the play was written sometime in the 1580s, when activities in Elizabeth's court and across the channel in the court of Henri III in France were becoming near mirrors of each other with regard to the very subject matter introduced as the crimes and punishment within this play. Before we dive any deeper into the legal analysis of the play, let us first look at the truest origins of the play. Its title is Hebrew. Yes, that's right. Hebrew. The saying has a long rabbinic tradition, but can also be traced back to ancient Mediterranean cultures. As a concept, it is found throughout the Bible, and as an idiom, it has found various forms throughout the centuries. An eye for an eye. What comes around goes around. What goes around comes around. He reaped what he has sown. You made your bed, now lie in it. All of these essentially stem from the Hebrew term mida k'neged mida, or measure for measure. Mida k'neged mida, and forgive my pronunciation, I don't speak Hebrew, and I know very little Hebrew. But mida k'neged mida essentially speaks of God's justice. There are countless references to this concept within the Old Testament and then echoed again in the New Testament. Do unto others as you would have done to you. And the reason for this mida k'neged mida, and again, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, but this is what it roughly translates to, is by a measure that a man measures, they will measure him. God metes out perfect justice, measure for measure. It is the very concept that gives the scales of justice, a form of measurement, and God will weigh the measure to be certain it is in balance. I believe the title itself of this play is a message to those that the play is meant to speak to. Those in power with their hands on the scales of justice, where everything will be measured. But in the end, it is God, or perhaps St. Peter at the pearly gates, or perhaps the fates and furies, or even the deities who hold sway over karma, who will ensure that we all reap what we have sown, measure for measure. It's a profound statement within a piece of comedic literature, dramatic literature indeed, but it's definitely a satire aimed to stab at those it pokes fun at, not unlike many of the plays in the Shakespearean canon. Indeed, it is in the final act that Isabella, a holy and reverent woman of the cloth, recently freed from a convent, a holy nun, calls out Angelo's heinous crimes and cries for justice, 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 justice. And if any actress delivered that line that way, I would go out of my mind. I always point out to actors that it is something exceptional when the bard gives you an opportunity to repeat the same word in sequence like that. It's a gift to the actor to choose how to emote the feelings of the character in that moment by changing the delivery of each subsequent repetition of the word. As Hamlet responds to Polonius, words, 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 he says, is what he is reading. Meaning, and in all three deliveries, how important words are and can be. Imagine a Hamlet who delivers the line, words, words, words. Imagine an Isabella who delivers the line, justice, 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 justice. That's not what he wants. It's not what he is telling the artist to do. It's a gift from the author to the actor. A man who wrote into his works more than 30,000 words doesn't have a character repeat the same word without extreme purpose. Stevens characterizes that moment as almost nonsensical repetition of the word, which she says underscores the hollowness of its meaning in the world of the play, in which the law is omnipresent, but justice seemingly absent. And she quotes Cicero. There are two types of injustice, one committed by people who inflict a wrong, another by those who fail to ward off from those on whom it is being inflicted, although it is in their power to do so. We hear that one pretty regularly today, don't we? If you're not working to solve the problem, you are a part of the problem. Evil is only possible when good men do nothing. We all have to do the work. These have become empty platitudes now, reduced to memes plastered about social media with the same hollowness that Stevens points out of justice in Measure for Measure, like the voice of a politician. Did our author know we would all need reminding of the themes of this play centuries down the road? I believe he did, because he gives us a play that takes this to a different level. It's not just those who do nothing who are at play and to blame in Measure for Measure. It is worse. It is the corruption of authority that perverts truth, grace, and the law, and then calls it good government, while practically destroying the fragile civic order of Vienna. Imagine living in a world where government authority corrupts and perverts truth, grace, and the law while calling it good government, practically destroying the civil and civic order of its society. Oh, that couldn't happen in today's day and age. Stevens channels good old Harold Bloom, who reminds us that Measure for Measure itself cannot be judged by applying moral realism. Really? Really, Harold? The characters in the storyline are over the top. As I mentioned before, it is biting satire, not unlike the type of satire Aristophanes first made famous in ancient Greece. But like Aristophanes, who was using his pen to attack the government structure that he witnessed such extreme frailties within, our author does the same. But he does so in a comic way as to sort of deflect attention from his pen. And in fact, the next time I produce Measure for Measure, I want to set it in Victorian times as a classic melodrama, with Angelo wearing a black top hat and cape, twisting his pencil-thin mustache and plotting to coerce the purloined damsel Isabella into his evil, seductive plot. Imagine her brother Claudio tied to the railroad tracks as Duke Vincenzio, hero in disguise, arrives just in time to save the day. The play has that type of flavor to it. It is purposefully outrageous. But Stevens asks exactly, how outrageous is this tale of justice? How outlandish is Shakespeare's depiction of a justice system arbitrated by one man or one power or one authority, a man who has very little interest in or compassion for his actual subjects, but is wielding the law to his own desire. She says the representatives of sanity in the play appear to be the gleefully unrepentant Pompey and the remorseless Barnardine, who apparently share the belief that if one ignores justice as embodied by the law, it will most likely just go away. But whether by ignoring it, invoking it, or enforcing it, every character of significance in the play is either operating the gears or caught in the machinery of the law. And in true Measure for Measure, the cast of characters are almost evenly divided between those who administer the law, the Duke, Aeschylus, Angelo, the Provost, Elbow, Aberson, and those who are subjects of the law, Claudio, Lucio, Froth, Isabella, Mariana, Giulietta, Mistress Overdone. Though Isabella is a nun, and there are some religious undertones to the play, Stevens warns us against that basis for analysis, but she does point to many studies that have examined the legality of the two marriage contracts within the play, and of course the law against fornication. I believe this is the crux of the play. Who within the Elizabethan court was not guilty of some sort of illegal, and I use air quotes here, fornication, including the queen herself? How can she mete out justice upon others when she herself is guilty of the same crime? In essence, Claudio has the defense of, everyone is doing it. I just got caught. Can the queen get caught? Must be nice to have that sort of exoneration, especially when you're the power of the land. In 1815, A.W. von Schlegel wrote that the piece takes improperly its name from the punishment. The true significance of the whole is the triumph of mercy over strict justice. No man being himself so free from errors as to be entitled to deal it out to his equals. Well, I would disagree with von Schlegel. When we look at the origins of the title, the Hebrew origins, the piece takes very properly its name. Because, as von Schlegel points out, no man being himself so free from errors to be entitled to deal it out to his equals, only God himself can mete out justice, measure for measure. Von Schlegel would argue, everyone is doing it, so no one has the right to judge or punish anyone else. In fact, within the play, Pompey the pimp is running around helping everyone do it. And then as a dot on the exclamation point of the stabbing humor, he reforms to become the executioner's assistant to help punish others guilty of the crime. That's ironic humor, and that's what the bard does best. Is Pompey the William Cecil character of this play? The so-called Puritan that Cecil was, who winked at the queen's dalliances with her courtiers, while attempting to fishmonger, yes, that's a Hamlet reference, his daughter to a noble lord, and then arranged a deceptive bed trick to deceive his son-in-law into fornication with his daughter. A part of the play that pops up in Measure for Measure. That is part of the true history of the life of William Cecil, his daughter Anne Cecil, and William's son-in-law, Edward de Vere. You see why this play has the 1580s written all over it, and Edward de Vere's life written all through it. Layers added in revision in 1601 through 1603, most likely, can throw us off the trail a bit on the date of composition, but they only serve to better illuminate Edward's life within the text. And we see evidence, perhaps, in those revisions of 1601 through 1603, not knowing, of course, what the original 1580s play looked like. But it's safe to say that some of the Duke Vincentio disguise stuff was a mechanism added later. Nonetheless, what we see is perhaps even that there is evidence that Edward was planning his disappearance into monastic life. And if you look at my 2-part series, Is Edward Dead?, you'll find a deep dive and exploration into those concepts. But I digress. Let's return to Measure for Measure and the law within the play. Virginia Stevens accurately points out that the content of the play has attracted many lawyers to weigh in on the play's deep legal references, to weigh in on Isabella's skills as a defense attorney, and on the laws of the day within England and France. Remember, there was a scandal going on in the court of Henri III in the 1580s that was similar to what the play is depicting. There is an argument made in favor of desuetude as defense. Now, Daniel Kornstein, a prominent figure in the study of Shakespeare and the law, describes this as a law that has been nullified through disuse, desuetude. He says, and I quote, "A finding of desuetude neither strikes the statute off the books nor activates it. The finding means only that the prosecution fails on grounds of desuetude." That's very interesting, very specific legal distinction. Stevens points out that the concept derives from continental and not English law. English law has no provision for dead laws. Thus, the bard chooses to set the play in a fictional Vienna on the continent rather than England. It also serves as some cover for his targeted attacks on members of the English court. Remember, our writer is absolutely brilliant, just like Aristophanes before him. In the introduction to her 1982 essay on marriage contracts in Measure for Measure, Margaret Scott states that no other of Shakespeare's plays has provoked more anxious fossicking among extrinsic and sometimes extraneous materials. What a great word, fossicking. It means to rummage or rifle through mostly documents, something that Shakespeare authorship super sleuths have been doing for more than a century. And I say, let's keep fossicking, fellow quillers. Nonetheless, Stevens says it is difficult to avoid fossicking with regards to this play because the play presents so many challenges to cogent interpretation that the temptation to escape from the irregularities of the text into the more straightforward pages of body court records and moral homilies is at times irresistible. Well, thank you, Virginia. That's a beautiful statement. And she's right. Ultimately, she says the play is primarily about disastrous bureaucracy, the kind that makes pimps turn into state-sanctioned killers. Wow. Let me say that again. Disastrous bureaucracy, the kind that makes pimps turn into state-sanctioned killers. And more specifically, the chaotic and culturally pervasive judicial systems of 16th and early 17th century England. Or even 21st century United States of America? I don't know. However fantastic the play's setting, and however unlikely its fairy tale laws, its foundation in reality is indisputable when it comes to the question of law, says Stevens. Not a specific law. The critical search for the latter being at what Scott levels her charges of fossicking, but rather the spirit of Western law. The play asks the unanswerable question: how do we control the laws that control us? And how do we maintain a legal system that is at once humane and effective? Well, the founding fathers of the United States would say the fourth estate, the media, was our insurance policy for this type of thing. But what happens when the media falls lockstep in line with government control? In Elizabethan England, this was the case. There was no free media, except perhaps for our author, who had some sort of freedom, some sort of ability to escape torture and death, to write these types of plays, to stab in the eye of the authoritarian bureaucracy the way that he does with Measure for Measure. This is, as it has ever been, an unresolved debate. How do we maintain a legal system that is at once humane and effective? And I would argue that a free and unbiased media is a part of that recipe. Stevens relays that this is part of the point of the play. Not the media part, but the part that it's difficult for a society to maintain such a legal system. And she says this is why the play has such a troublesome ending. Yet it is nothing but true. The ending is true to the subject of the play. The play cannot have anything but a troublesome ending because that's the point of the story. Measure for Measure is concerned with definitions. By closely examining the radical divide that occurs between the active law and the intellectual construct of justice, the play questions whether the applied law ever adequately expresses the principles that supposedly underlie it. Very good. Very good, Virginia. One key point of the message is that many true definitions cannot be found. That's what I think. The only answer then is the Hebrew origin. Mida kneged mida. In his analysis, Richard Posner, another big name when it comes to Shakespeare and the law, states that Western thought depends upon equity, mercy, justice, and the needs of the community to temper intractable law. To attempt to shield strict rule of law from the influence of any one of these concepts is the antithesis of law. Posner says, the mixture is not inconsistent with the idea of law. It is the idea of law. So let's revisit that for just a moment. Western thought depends upon equity, mercy, justice, and the needs of the community to temper intractable law. To attempt to shield strict rule of law from the influence of any one of these concepts is the antithesis of law. The mixture is not inconsistent with the idea of law. The mixture is the idea of law, the mixture of equity, mercy, justice, and the needs of the community to temper intractable law. Well, that doesn't sound like blind justice at all, does it? It's a slippery slope. It's a big gray area that obviously our author truly understood the perils and the pitfalls that came with it as well. The bard displays the complexity involved in balancing these elements. For leaning too heavily on any one of them might fatally tip the scales of justice, and that is what is played out in the text of Measure for Measure. Thus says Stevens. What a dilemma. Under the laws of Vienna, Claudio, Isabella's brother, is sentenced to die for impregnating Giulietta. He makes a convincing defense of intending to love and provide for her whether or not they are legally wed. But for Claudio to be shown mercy based on the circumstances of his case would serve to undermine the immutability of the law and create an argument for clemency for both Lucio and Angelo, who are essentially guilty of the same crime, but without Claudio's sympathetic circumstances. The law is of necessity blind to these details, and as Posner puts it, both the extreme of hyper-legalism and the opposite extreme of a purely discretionary system of justice are found only in primitive societies. Mature societies mix strict law with discretion. In other words, says Stevens, in order for law to function, it must somehow contain the very elements that counter it. Interesting. So what of Vienna with its strict statutes and most biting laws, as described in Act 1, Scene 2 of the play? By the Duke's own admission, it is negligence, not mercy, that has caused Vienna's moral decay. But his choice of Angelo as the new enforcer is what Posner would call hyper-legalism. So Vienna becomes a metaphor for the conflict between the rule of law and discretion. And Stevens says its fictional struggles resonate with the very real events occurring in contemporary England. I agree. Stevens agrees with Margaret Scott, who declares that Measure for Measure is not a history play and therefore cannot, quote, contain much detail which accords specifically with the given historical situation. That's where I don't agree. Because those of us who know the very true history of Edward de Vere know that Stevens and Scott are incorrect. Though Measure for Measure is a fictionalized melodrama of sorts, we know that it and its characters are based solidly upon very real people and very true events. What Stevens and Scott do agree upon is that the storybook nature of the tale does serve as a direct metaphor for bureaucratic turmoil, and its depiction of what happens when justice gets tangled up in questions of rules is very prescient. Let me say that again. The storybook nature of the tale does serve as a direct metaphor for bureaucratic turmoil, and its depiction of what happens when justice gets tangled up in questions of rules is prescient. Legal historian J.H. Baker writes, in some ways, those controversies formed the first phase of the 17th century constitutional revolution. Wow. Meaning that the works of Shakespeare had their thumb on necessary and impending changes in the law of the land. And only a great legal mind of the time could have possibly anticipated the tremendous events upon the horizon, particularly in the realm of the law. And most specifically in this play, we deal with some issues of, go figure, contract law. Stevens tells us that approaching the text from this direction is fruitful because contract law is the juncture at which the many disparate elements of the play come together, arguing for per verba de presenti or per verba de futura, the two different types of marriage contract often cited to explain the legality of Claudio and Giulietta's betrothal. But these alone do not make sense of the corruption and confusion in Vienna. And she says the oddity of the play is that it seemingly is unconcerned with making a specific comment on the laws concerning nuptials. Well, according to Shakespeare's Legal Language, a dictionary written by, of course, the famous B.J. and Mary Sokol, these held that even a private and verbal agreement to marry either immediately or in the future, per verba de presenti, verbal contract for the present, or per verba de futura, verbal contract for the future, would immediately create a valid marriage, prohibiting marriage with any other person, and de presenti contracts needed no further steps to confer full married status. Stevens wrote, I do not think the presence or lack of contract is what is legally at stake in the play, but I am by no means dismissing its relevance. The question of contract occurs too often within the canon to be ignored. All charges of fossicking aside. She has a sense of humor. I like her. Well, of course, Edward's life was filled with legal battles over contract law. And at the time Edward was thrown into prison for impregnating Anne Vavasour, he was already married and now estranged from his wife for several years. Is there some potential argument being made here for the annulment of his marriage to Anne Cecil, if he had indeed already entered into a verbal contract with someone else, a per verba de presenti, or even a per verba de futuro? This is a question that pops up in Romeo and Juliet. Juliet is already married to Romeo, not just in contract of per verba, but by the law of the land and by an ordained priest. She cannot marry Paris. What does she do? This is a theme that pops up in other parts of the canon as well. One must wonder, even if you're an Orthodox scholar, do you have to wonder, did William Shakespeare, if you believe he were the writer, have a contract with someone else before Anne Hathaway? Or vice versa? Did he create a contract with Anne Hathaway that forbade him from marrying anyone else? But perhaps Stevens is correct that the message of the play isn't about nuptials at all. It's about the hypocrisy of guilty authority and the peculiarities of the English legal system structured to administer mercy, equity, and strict justice independently of each other. Not as Posner would have, all combined, but independent. As Stevens says, the vagaries inherent in a judicature that divided its rulings between Posner's discretionary and hyper-legal aspects generated feelings of ambivalence amongst those subject to its laws. Or as historian Martin Ingram put it, all legal institutions in this period faced similar difficulties and similar opportunities, and all had to work within a climate of popular opinion, which, though largely accepting the rule of law, did not regard the courts and legal practitioners, especially legal practitioners, as an unmitigated blessing. Ingram has a sense of humor as well. This judicial inconsistency often resulted in rulings that ranged from ludicrous to terrifying. For the system was a somewhat unhappy marriage of feudal retributive justice, Christian mercy, and local custom. This nearly constant presence in the life of English citizens was a difficult landscape to navigate, even for one who was educated in the law at the Inns of Court. Stevens argues that by bouncing in and out of the three branches of the legal system, the Chancery Court, the Court of Common Law, and the Ecclesiastical Court, Measure for Measure underscores the dangers of adhering to a singular vision of justice and argues that the best possible system of governance by law leaves itself open to the possibility of more than one right way, and even more importantly, recognizes that its relationship with the community it professes to govern should be the cornerstone of any expression of so-called justice. She then commits the next 3 chapters of her thesis to the study of these 3 branches of law within the text, focusing on Duke Vincentio as the embodiment of ecclesiastical law. He does, of course, disguise himself as a monk. Angelo as the harbinger of common law. He is deputized and asked to clean up the Viennese society by becoming a law enforcer. And Aeschylus, the wise adjudicator of the chancery, the old man who adheres to the long-held portions of the law that are tradition. Stevens' brilliant analysis demonstrates that the writer of the play had a full knowledge and understanding of the history of all of these 3, their roots and origins, changes made throughout the centuries, and most specifically, how they evolved during the reign of King Henry VIII and subsequently his daughter, Elizabeth I. But as Stevens points out in her introduction, it is really the character journey of Isabella that ties all of this together so creatively and magnificently as only the brilliant mind of our bard could do. And perhaps as a subtle hint about potential hidden leanings within Stevens' mind, she titles the 5th and final chapter of her thesis before her conclusion as Truth is Truth, Isabella's Journey to Justice. Interesting title there. Stevens stresses that the close of Measure for Measure finds Isabella kneeling with Mariana in a reflection of the idea of sympathy, the type of sympathy that allows a person to trade perspectives with another. Portrayed here as a lesson that sympathy is necessary in order to truly enact mercy. And once again, I point to Portia in Merchant as perhaps a more developed version of Isabella, especially when it comes to the quality of mercy. Both of them work as defense attorneys in the face of justice. Both request that mercy be considered, but more importantly, understood. And that's a huge distinction. To consider mercy is within the right of the monarch. It is within the right of the court. But to understand mercy is something we are all compelled to do. Stevens sees Measure for Measure as an indictment of the separation and the struggle among the ecclesiastical, the common law, and the chancery courts. And Isabel's character is, as she says, a knave, the central place where the spokes of the conflicting legal philosophies of the play come together. And she points out that Isabella's metamorphosis has little to do with Christian redemption. She is a nun, by the way. and everything to do with mature vision of secular justice. Don't let the nun's habit fool you. It's a theatrical construct. She currently explains that Isabel's action, her choice to join with Mariana, fully embodies all of the principles examined in the play: mercy, equity, and the written law. And it shows how these three elements must all be present in a healthy system of justice. Isabella's plea to Angelo on behalf of her brother Claudio is not one that argues he is innocent, but rather a plea for mercy on the grounds that every human heart is guilty of, at the very least, bad intentions, if not the very crime they choose to judge others for committing. In essence, she's the first one saying to Angelo, everyone is doing it, perhaps even you. My brother just got caught. Perhaps even you. Little does she know. That's part of the humorous irony. I will have your virginity. But in the argument of mercy for justice, Isabella takes the self-righteous path. She herself judges her brother and offers little in the way of forgiveness because she is not guilty of the same crimes. She's a nun. She couldn't be tempted. No way. The Duke makes a similar argument when he says in Act 4, Scene 3, when vice makes mercy, mercy's so extended that for the false love is the offender friended. When vice makes mercy, mercy is so extended that for the false love is the offender friended. As Lord Capulet would say in Romeo and Juliet, that's chopped logic. Stephen is correct that both Isabella and Vincentio pervert the idea of mercy, which should be generated by love and an admission of mutual humanity, not by guilt and the knowledge of a shared vice. I will give you mercy because I'm guilty too. That's definitely not what Portia is telling us in Merchant of Venice. And that's definitely not the Hebrew mida kneged mida concept at all. It is ironic that it is Isabella who must best learn the true qualities of mercy and how they play a part in justice. As a holy nun who cannot conceive of committing such illicit crimes as have and are occurring before her and around her, she takes the rigid stance that mercy should be given only to the deserving. She is the embodiment of both the Duke and Angelo. The one believes that too much freedom has led to decay of the court. The other that crimes should be therefore punished immediately and harshly in order to restore order. Isabella's logic is that mercy should be granted only to the virtuous, and that justice is most deserved by those same virtuous people. This is how the bard points out that true justice should not evaluate good or evil. Virtue has nothing to do with it. That is the blindness of the law. But just laws do indeed and should include motivations as a deciding factor in guilt or innocence. Did you mean to commit the crime? Did a malice aforethought is the current modern phrase we use. Did the defendant demonstrate malice aforethought? At first, Isabella does not consider Claudio's motivations, only his actions. To quote another play, how absolute the knave is. She echoes these same feelings when she first meets Mariana and learns her plight, basically stating that death is the best solution for the wronged maid. Is this Edward's statement about his plight and the plight of Anne Vavasor? Is he tempting the queen to mete out a sentence of death for them both and their child too? How absolute does the Duke's, Queen's, justice need to be? When Isabella ultimately kneels with Mariana before the Duke to plead for Angelo, it is evident that Isabella has a new understanding of what mercy truly is and how it may serve justice in the end. Stevens recounts Robert Bennett, who says, justice exists in the resolution of contending forces, not in single laws or simple retributive equivalents. An eye for an eye is not actually justice in all cases, and certainly not in this case. In essence, the bard uses Isabella to paint a picture of mercy that is driven by logic, not emotion, and therefore pays perfect reverence to the precepts of justice within the law. In Act 5, Scene 1, she pleads to the Duke, "Look, if it please you, on this man condemned as if my brother lived. I partly think a due sincerity governed his deeds, till he did look on me." Well, she's kind of vain, isn't she? "My brother had but justice, in that he did the thing for which he died." She thinks he's dead at this point. We know that he's not. But nonetheless, for Angelo, his act did not o'ertake his bad intent, and must be buried but as an intent that perished by the way. She is speaking about motive or intent with regard to action and commission. Angelo was motivated with intent to commit a crime, but his crime was thwarted before it could be committed. Claudio did commit a crime and was caught. Claudio's death would be unfortunate, but lawful. However, to execute Angelo for his thoughts would be wrong. For as she says, thoughts are no subjects, intents, but merely thoughts. Sounds a lot like misprision of treason to me. To think about it is not to do it. And Isabella pleads for justice that incorporates the elements she has come to realize must exist in a justice system aimed at serving its subjects, all of its subjects. Stevens concludes that it is Robert Bennett's words, "Justice exists in the resolution of contending forces," that sum up the driving arguments of Measure for Measure. She says the bard, through the metaphorical city of Vienna, illustrates the conflicts that raged in the English judiciary during the late 16th century and eventually led to dramatic reforms of both the system and its laws later on. She tells us that almost 300 years later, and an entire ocean away, it was Oliver Wendell Holmes who wrote, "The first requirement of a sound body of law is that it should correspond with the actual feelings and demands of the community, whether right or wrong." Well, thank you, Justice Holmes. It is tremendous that the great legal mind behind the writing of this play could see the importance of these concepts and how they would someday turn all of Europe on its head, paving the way for constitutional democracy and the modern ideal of basic human rights. The bard warned us that clinging to a single ideology, let me repeat that. The bard warned us that clinging to a single ideology of any kind, let alone of justice, results not only in the blind justice meted out fairly to all, but instead in a blindness that is not just at all. I want to repeat that because it's worth repeating. He warned us that clinging to a single ideology of justice results not in the blind justice meted out fairly to all, but instead in a blindness that is not just at all. Measure for Measure is a revolutionary play written at a time when the age was quickly approaching a crossroads of changes in the law. It points to a struggling government system of justice that craved reforms, and though many of the aspects of the play can be viewed as dark and ominous, it still uses humor and melodrama to present a profound vision of hope for a future that will include basic legal protections for the subjects of the law. It harkens back to the earliest origins of law and justice. Mida knegt mida. By a measure that a man measures, they will measure him. As Stevens sums up in the final statement of her thesis, and I quote, "The argument that the play presents is simple. Before we presume to judge another, we must first look deeply within ourselves, and furthermore, think deeply about how we would like to be judged. This act of imaginative communion may perhaps bring us closest to a justice system capable of engendering transformation and redemption to a world community whose only common trait is being human." Amen, sister. Amen. Thank you for listening, fellow Quillers. It is always my pleasure to join you in this quest for truth and exploration for answers. Remember, you can find all things Quiller in nature at our website, don'tquillthepodcast.com. Don'tquillthepodcast.com. There is no apostrophe in the word don't. Right from the homepage, you can subscribe to our email list. You can order Quiller merchandise from the swag shop and visit our Patreon page where you can learn about the various levels of support available and find our growing library of bonus features, including this month's special bonus, a new movie watch along with my wife Annie and I, Franco Zeffirelli's 1967 classic, Taming of the Shrew, starring Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton. It's a fun exploration of the film after the two of us just having played those two roles on stage together in classic Taylor Burton tradition. So if you'd like to join us for a movie, go to the bonus feature library and find this month's new bonus feature, Taming of the Shrew Watch Along. And to those of you who have been and remain loyal supporters of the show, we thank you for all that you do. It is because of you that we are here. And now, without further ado, it's time to spin the wheel of destiny and announce the July 2024 Quiller of the Month. While the electronic wheel does its thing, I'd like to remind you that the Quiller of the Month does receive not only tremendous bragging rights, but also an access code to select a free item from the Quiller swag shop. This month's winner is Frank Lawler. Congratulations, Frank. Thank you for your continued support, and watch from an email from producer Jake about how to claim your prize. As for the rest of you Quillers around the world, don't forget to give us a rate and a review at your favorite podcast streaming site. Share us with your friends. Help us grow the Quiller Nation. And until next time, keep asking questions.
If you've enjoyed today's episode, please leave a rating and review in your podcast player. For even more, visit our website, don'tquillthepodcast.com. There you can find official merchandise in our shop, as well as a link to our Patreon. This show is made possible by people like you. We hope you'll consider showing your support by becoming a monthly patron, where you'll receive bonus material and tons of exclusive perks. You can also join in the conversation on our Discord and by following us at Don't Quill the Pod on all social media. All of this can be found at don'tquillthepodcast.com, don'tquillthepodcast.com.
It's Dragon Wagon.